Welcome to this Texas Modern CLE Victims webinar. Our presentation today is on the dynamics of the domestic violence dynamics. Follow along with the help sheet with the exact same name in the Texas Modern CLE toolkit. You can access it in the Texas Modern Mediation and CLE mobile app, or you can download it at texasmodernmediation.com. Each presenter will introduce themselves as we spend about 25% of our time on each column. For this family violence portion of the webinar, each of these presentations are 1 hour. All the others will be shorter if you're used to taking all of our courses. So now, our presentation.
Hello, everyone. My name is Andy Guay, and I'm a staff attorney at the Texas Advocacy Project. We're a nonprofit law firm that works with survivors and victims of domestic violence, and we provide free legal services to them all across the state of Texas. Now, domestic violence, I think, can be an uncomfortable subject to talk about because a lot of people aren't too familiar with it, and it's a pretty new subject to them. But I think it's extremely important to discuss so that we can be better able to assist any victims we come across and to hopefully raise awareness and educate others regarding this situation. Now, we don't always hear about domestic violence when it happens. Right now, there's a large media covering regarding the Gabby Petito situation, which is a pretty prime example of domestic violence, but it's not something that gets a lot of coverage. But it's still something that is pretty prevalent within our society. Some of the reasons why it may not be such a much more discussed topic could be for a variety of reasons. One of the biggest reasons, I believe, is because it's such an underreported crime. Whenever I speak with clients doing initial consultations or intakes, most of the time when I ask them if domestic violence has occurred, they always, a large majority of the time, respond and they say yes. And when I ask them if they've ever reported it, they'll tell me no. And they'll give me a variety of different reasons why they've never reported it. It could range from the victim not wanting to get their abuser in trouble with law enforcement or other government agencies. It can range from the victim at times feeling they won't be believed. Perhaps they have reported it and they didn't get the response they thought they would get from law enforcement, so they don't continue to report it. And then lastly, at times the victim is just conditioned to believe that what they're going through isn't domestic violence. It happens so frequently that they feel as though it's a normal part of a routine and a normal part of their lives, and it's not something worth reporting. So, and when going through this topic, it's important to remember that even though we don't always hear about it and the statistics may seem a little low, it's very possible that those numbers could be a lot higher just because it's not something that is reported all that often. Now, as I was researching for this presentation, some statistics that I came up, they're a little old, but again, I'm going to attribute part of that to there not being so much data available because it's an underreported crime. But some of the stats I came up with from the National Council Against Domestic Violence, in 2013, there were over 76, and these are Texas-specific statistics. So in 2013, there were over 76,000 reported cases of abuse by a current or former spouse. Now, those are just reported. That number could definitely be a lot higher than that. And just look at in 2014, Texas domestic hotlines answered over 185,000 calls. And so that really shows the difference between a reported call to possibly law enforcement or other government agencies, as opposed to how often domestic violence actually does happen. It can happen, that 185,000, that's more than double the actual reported calls. So that just goes to show how prevalent domestic violence is within our society, even though the statistics that we have may not necessarily reflect that. And then lastly, one concerning statistic that I found is this can even affect even younger adults, sort of older children. About 75% of Texas 16 to 24-year-olds have experienced domestic violence, or they know someone that has experienced domestic violence. So this isn't just an issue that's affecting adults as well, it's affecting children of all ages as well as younger adults as well. And one kind of big myth I want to dispel about domestic violence is there is this notion that it just occurs that women are the victims and males are the abusers. And that's sort of a myth that's going on, and the statistics kind of do support that. I believe 1 in 3 in the US, out of every 3 women will experience domestic violence, and 1 out of 4 men will experience domestic violence. However, now it is important to remember that. I want to make sure everyone's being listened. But it's important to note that the disparity in this may not necessarily be that males are just prone to more violence. It could be due to a lack of reporting, as I was going into before. I've certainly spoken with my fair share of male victims who have been abused. And when I ask them, why didn't you report the abuse? They've given me a variety of different reasons. One is that they didn't feel as they would be believed. You know, who would believe that a 6'2" male could be assaulted by a 5'4" female? Or they didn't feel their concerns were going to be treated equally. They didn't feel as though they were going to be heard. And so they thought, why bother reporting this? If I'm not going to get the help that I need, why report any of this? And so it's important to keep in mind that if someone says they're a victim of domestic violence, we want to make sure we're taking the time to really listen to them, to make sure they're feeling validated, and to really address all of their concerns, because anyone, regardless of gender or how they identify themselves, can be a victim of domestic violence. Now, we've been talking about domestic violence and family violence, but really what is that? And so now we kind of want to look to the legal definition of what is family violence. And you can find this in the family code, you can find it in the penal code, but basically what it boils down to is how it's legally defined is physical harm being caused by a family member, former or current dating partner, spouse, etc., them causing physical harm or threatening physical harm to their family member or current partner or former partner. That's what the legal definition of family violence is. However, as individuals who work with victims of domestic violence, we can see that it's much more than that. It doesn't always cause physical harm, but it has other, there are sort of non-criminal acts of domestic violence that can really cause devastating impacts, devastating consequences to victims and their lives. And so some examples of non-criminal acts that should constitute domestic abuse or domestic violence are financial and economic abuse. And this is when an abuser could purposefully keep money hidden away from their spouse, from the relationship partner, so that the other person is not aware of what really may all be there. It can be just perhaps giving them a minimal weekly allowance just so they can barely buy their basic necessities. It could be not allowing them access to any financial institutions, banks, credit cards, anything to really help them support themselves so that they're reliant on their abuser. Another form is gaslighting. This is something that we've been hearing more and more of recently. Gaslighting is really when an abuser manipulates a victim's perception of reality to where that they don't really know what's happening. And this could be when an abuser manipulates the victim into thinking that the victim is actually the abuser. and that the abuser is the one being victimized, maybe by not getting everything they ask for or everything that they want, to where the victim doesn't even know if they're being abused, if they're the abuser. They don't know what's real anymore. And then we have emotional abuse. This could be when an abuser will, some examples of this are when an abuser perhaps constantly belittles their partner, name calling, etc., makes them feel as though they're not worthy of their attention, worthy of their life. It could be that the abuser isolates them from their friends and family and doesn't allow them to retain or create their own independent support system. So the victim constantly feels as though they have to rely on their abuser for any type of support, emotional, financial, any type of support. And so now that we've seen what the criminal acts and what the non-criminal acts of domestic violence are, what's really the end game behind those acts? What's the reason an abuser engages in this conduct? Some may say it's to cause harm to the victim, and that can be partially correct, especially with physical violence. The purpose, part of it may be to harm their victim. But when you have things like gaslighting or financial abuse and emotional abuse, there's no physical element to that. So why else would the abuser be engaging in those actions? And the truth is, they engage in those actions because, for the most part, abuse is centered around the fact that it's meant to create this power and control dynamic where the victim.
Andy, we got about 3 minutes left, so wrap up in 1 minute, because then I want to show everybody your website and have you show us a little bit about your website.
Okay, not a problem. So the main purpose of abuse by an abuser is really to create that power and control dynamic, to just have that victim constantly be under their control and not feel as though they have a way to get out or escape from their abusive situation. So that abuser can constantly feel as if they are in control of the situation.
Okay, now this is the Texas Advocacy Project.org website. What would you like me to show and navigate around? What resources do you have on your website?
Okay, so this is our website. As you can see, like I said earlier, we're here to provide free legal services to victims of domestic violence. On that banner up at the very top, you'll see where it says Get Help Now. And there are a variety of different ways individuals can apply for our services. One is that they can apply online by clicking that tab right there. They're taken to sort of an online little interview sheet where they can submit their information. Someone from our organization will give them a call back and schedule them an appointment to speak with one of our attorneys for a free consultation about their legal situation. And they can also call our legal hotline. That's in that banner as well. It should be in that gray banner right there. They can call that number, 1-800-374-HOPE, get scheduled to speak with one of our attorneys, where they can kind of talk about their situation and kind of determine what legal remedies and other options may be available to them.
Let's talk about the training that the Texas Advocacy Project offers, Andy. For legal professionals, if we go into your training, what are we going to find that might be of interest to those watching this Texas Modern CLE Victims webinar right now?
Sure. So we always want to provide, more awareness about domestic violence, and that's what these trainings are meant to do. We recently started sort of an online training portal where if someone wants to learn more about protective orders or dating violence and the different types of digital abuse that now occurs, we have different training courses along with that, and they can also contact our training department and schedule a training more specifically geared towards them about those different topics.
Okay, what else on Texas on your primary website should we be aware of?
Let's see. There's also a chat function at the very bottom right, where if someone wants to chat as well, maybe they're not able to talk on the phone. For whatever reason, they can also try to apply that way, in a little more discreet way.
So texasadvocacyproject.org is the web address. And now our next presenter.
Thanks, Tom, and thanks to you too, Andy. Hello, everyone. My name is Anedia Akpan. I'm an attorney based in Houston. There we go. Sorry. I work in-house for the Metropolitan Transit Authority of Harris County, but prior to working in-house, I was a family law attorney and did practiced a number of cases in domestic violence court. I continue to work in that space just on a pro bono and advocacy awareness level, and also do quite a bit of intersectional work and human trafficking too. So I'm very grateful to be here with all of you. And thanks again, Andy, for kicking everything off. So just to reiterate one of the points that Andy made is that domestic violence is experienced across a wide spectrum of populations. It can be perpetrated against men, against the elderly. It does manifest in same-sex relationships across various socioeconomic stratas. But however, despite this data, domestic violence is still primarily and highly gendered in nature. And I look at that phenomenon through this sort of three-pronged analysis. First is looking at gender inequity. So looking at the root causes of violence against women and how those root causes are gendered. I also look at the patterns of perpetration and victimization. Those patterns are gendered as well. Women are overwhelmingly survivors and men are overwhelmingly perpetrators of domestic violence. And thirdly, I look at the impacts of violence, how they affect women and men differently. So looking at analyzing a bit more into that first prong related to gender inequity and equality, the language I prefer to use, or at least like to use as kind of like an encompassing term that would include domestic violence, is violence against women. And I'll explain why in a moment. Violence against women is defined as a social condition characterized by unequal value afforded to men and women and an unequal distribution of power, resources, and opportunity between them. So examples of that would be income disparities linked to job stratification, cultural, societal, gender expectations, education, healthcare access, et cetera. And the reason why I like to or prefer to use violence against women when I'm sort of speaking about the framework of domestic violence is, it explicitly acknowledges that women are the predominant survivors of violence. It acknowledges the gendered nature of violence, which is violence is directed against a woman because she is a woman, or violence that affects women disproportionately. And it also allows a focus on other forms of violence that often intersect with domestic violence that form part of a broader web of violence that women experience. So this is at the individual level, the relationship level, community, and societal level. And it also includes, I had mentioned human trafficking before, but this term encompasses other forms of violence against women, including trafficking of women and sexual exploitation. So in summation, the importance of using the language violence against women is, firstly, it recognizes that domestic violence against women is a public health problem and a human rights violation of worldwide significance. It encompasses a multitude of abuses directed at women and girls. Andy brought up the experience of young girls who also are survivors of violence. So this encompasses the young ladies as well over their lifespan. And using the term women emphasizes that this is a problem rooted in inequality between women and men. The second prong is looking at patterns of victimization and perpetration, how those patterns are gendered. The perpetration, as aforementioned, of domestic violence is highly gendered, as women tend to be on the higher side of survivors of domestic violence, according to data provided that Andy alluded to earlier. A recent study showed, this is a study out of Dallas from 2020, that 151 women and 34 men in Texas were killed as a result of domestic violence, with 98% of those murders done by an opposite sex partner.
So does that mean that about 80% of the murders, the victims were women?
Yes, the data is about 81%. Yes, wow. 4 out of 5 survivors were women who were killed by a husband, boyfriend, or a casual male partner. Yes, so that data is, you're absolutely right, Tom, that data is spot on. And then the final prong, the third prong, discussing the gendered nature of domestic violence, is how violence is experienced differently between women and men. So speaking on kind of a broader landscape, men are most at risk of violence from other men. But women are most at risk of violence from men. Men are most at risk of violence from men that they do not know, and women are most at risk from men that they do know. Men are most at risk of experiencing violence, usually in a public setting, in a public space, and women oftentimes are at risk of experiencing violence within the private space, like within their home.
Oh, that's actually really interesting what you're talking about. So men experience it publicly from men, women experience it privately from men. And
yes.
So even how they experience it and the likelihood of having other witnesses observe it.
Exactly.
You know, and as a former prosecutor myself, I've never even thought about that.
Right. It's Andy's point about power and control. Certainly isolation is a huge part of that. And I've worked on cases where I've represented someone who has said, you know, my spouse waits until the children are out of the house. My, mother or father who's living with me is at their, bingo game, etc. There's this, keeping it close to the chest so that other people aren't aware that it's going on. That's a huge part of the power dynamic. So yes, Tom, absolutely. And, in addition to not only how violence is experienced, but the impact of violence between men and women, there can be differentiations as well. Women are far more likely than men to be sexually assaulted, especially within the framework of some sort of domestic violence occurring. Higher rates of psychological harm, mental health problems, post-separation violence from former partners. That happens a lot to women. And there's certainly higher numbers, at least from the data that we've seen, of women being killed by their intimate partner or former intimate partner, in contrast to men. So shifting into the specific risks that survivors face, physically certainly is the most prominent one. Short-term physical effects of violence vary from bruises to cuts to broken bones, and then of course long-term physical effects where a woman can have been so badly beaten that she ends up with a traumatic brain injury. It's a wide spectrum of physical assault that women and women survivors endure, and it's important that people know that there's a wide spectrum of that. A lot of survivors, kind of to a point that Tom made about doing things within the home, A lot of survivors, especially survivors with children, when these sorts of physical injuries are happening, will be very protective of keeping that from their children and from their loved ones and family and people at work if they go out to work. So something that I've talked to people about is just because you can't see an injury or see a bruise or see cut, that doesn't mean that nothing is going on there. Yeah, I see Allison nodding her head and Robert and Tom's nodding their head. Like, that's something that people need to be very aware of. The survivors are very, very meticulous about protecting what's going on the outside and protecting certainly their children, so they don't know what's going on between them and their spouse or partner. Another important or another big aspect as far as risks that domestic violence survivors face is economic security. Another point that Andy brought up. Economic security is a huge defense against domestic violence, as survivors, particularly women, need access to financial resources to escape an abusive partner or seek help. For women who work and who are survivors of domestic violence, there's patterns of lost productivity and earnings. Data shows, this was a study that, and this will be in my help sheet, that women across the country collectively can lose up to 8 million days of paid work each year from, because they're staying home, they're trying to manage the kids, they may be trying to go to the doctor when the spouse isn't in the house. So loss of earnings is another residual of economic effect that domestic survivors have to endure. But then just speaking from like sort of a broader economic status discussion, when we talk about women who might be working, lower income women or lower middle income women, economic stressors are a key contributing factor to domestic violence as well. So it's not even just losing, hours of work, but for people who may be in sort of economically stressed homes where money and access to money is a problem, that has certainly been a stressor that's contributed to domestic violence, particularly during this pandemic.
Yeah.
Sorry, Tom, were you going to say something?
When you've been physically abused, when one thing goes wrong and then something else goes wrong, like a financial consequence, or you have to keep going back to a doctor's visit to deal with an injury from it, 2, 3, 4 things start happening and they have a cumulative effect. And we need to remember that, it's just not that they had one thing happen to them, but it may have, it's a, death by 1,000 paper cuts, right? Yes. 5 or 6 minor things may also happen with a major thing, or maybe she or he loses their job because they're in the hospital for 2 weeks.
Yes.
Or they call a false CPS report against them, and then they have to deal with that. And I just remember when I was training for a marathon, or also for preparing for a legal case, I'd always tell myself 7 things are going to go wrong. Just be prepared. Someone's going to step on your foot. You're going to miss a water bottle. The exhibit's not going to get in. Your laptop's going to run out of power. But you know what? With these people, every one thing that goes wrong can have a cumulative effect to them. And yes. One of the things when we designed this webinar was to affect how law firms and law practices did intake of victims. Did change from the beginning. What are our intake questions, right? What are the things we need to be sensitive to? And the things that you're talking about that I'd never thought about, right? My intake questions should change. Was it in a private setting or a public setting, right? If it's in public, are there video cameras? If there's private, does he wait until he gets the kids out of there? Mm-hmm. Is there a methodology to his madness, right?
Yes.
And so you got about Anetia, you got about 30 seconds to wrap up. Go ahead.
Oh my gosh. Oh, well.
I told you it goes fast. Go ahead.
It did go fast. Well, in my 30 seconds, I'll say regarding the sort of intersectional, sort of the nuanced experiences that survivors go through, not only related to sort of economic issues, physical, medical issues as well, is for people to please be cognizant and sensitive to the intersectional experiences experienced by survivors who are women of color, of queer women. There are a lot of, something that Andy brought about myths. Domestic violence does happen in same-sex and queer relationships, and people will use in those relationships internalized homophobia to, refusing to use people's pronouns, threatening to out someone if they're not out yet. So there are a lot of,
that's also a really good point. So I'm not a homosexual, okay, but when I do intake, I need to be sensitive when he says, "Oh, my man beat me up," or whatever is the right politically correct way to say it, right? I need to make sure that my intake process is sensitive to where that victim's coming from, regardless of whether I've experienced that lifestyle or that form of abuse before. And I'm glad you pointed that out. Okay, who's next?
I think that would be me, Tom.
My good friend, Allison Spencer. Allison, you participated in many of our webinars.
Yes.
Some people know that you've actually run a practice, a family law practice, that in part is structurally designed to prevent divorce. And I'm so glad to have you back, Allison.
Thank you. And I am glad to be here. Thank you for having me. So I am Allison Spencer. I've been practicing for about 18 years now. And one of my favorite topics to discuss is domestic violence. And we work really hard in our practice to help protect the victims. And we also do on the side have a resource and abuse network called VOCE, VOCE. And you can reach that. It does serve Harris and contiguous counties and some other counties, but 713-934-8800 is the number. If you do know a woman experiencing any type of domestic violence, we can offer some help. A lot of times,
Allison, I'm going to do you one better. You give me 2 full-page ads, and I'll put it for free in this toolkit that's going out to 15,000 legal professionals.
Fantastic.
So remind me about that after.
Fantastic, for sure. And a lot of times, we represent people who don't look like people who would end up in shelters. There is this stereotype out there that, someone who's been abused or has been a battered person would end up in a shelter, but, sometimes they look like me. And you need to be sensitive to that, that anyone at any time can be a victim of domestic violence. One of the first things that I'd like to explore is just a working knowledge of what post-traumatic stress syndrome is and post-traumatic stress disorder. Those words are kind of used interchangeably in our society, and people don't necessarily know exactly what goes into that as far as the diagnostic features and the criteria. And of course, we're not mental health professionals, but we are attorneys and counselors at law. And so to be able to have a general understanding and a working knowledge of what PTSD is, you might want to pick up a DSM-5, which is the most recent version of Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders that psychologists, counselors, mental health professionals use, and just have a good working knowledge, not just what Google says about what PTSD is, because in most domestic violence cases, there is some level of that, either specified or unspecified at work. And so you do want to know, as you're sitting across the conference table and interviewing someone, what they may actually be struggling with and what the high risks of, suicide that goes with that and, might be present, and you need to be prepared for what that is. So I just point you to that. We're not here to diagnose people, but just to be aware of some of the things that may be at play across your conference table. So PTSD actually is exposure to an actual or threatened death, serious injury, or sexual violence. There's a lot of things that go into it as far as intrusion symptoms, where people are having, who have experienced a traumatic event, are experiencing recurrent involuntary and intrusive distressing memories. They're having distressing dreams. They're having dissociative reactions to, like flashbacks to events that were traumatic for them to experience. So just having a working knowledge, again, of that understanding of how their brain has taken in information is very important, because it's not always a reasonable understanding of what they've gone through. And here we are interviewing them and trying to use deductive reasoning to help them and to advocate for them appropriately. And that might not be exactly the dialogue that needs to take place. Our brain's job, the encoding of memory and information recall from someone who has not experienced trauma is pretty general. You think back to an event, you remember a happy time, you may have some sensory recollection, maybe a smell triggers you, or some type of sense of that event, and you get a picture in your mind. That is not what happens to domestic violence victims who have experienced some level of trauma. They don't have that general encoding, storage, and recall the way that a more healthy individual that's not experienced that might have. Our brains, they're very it's a very powerful organ. And there's something called neural connection. That is when our bodies are exposed to any stimulus and it reaches what's called a stimulus threshold. Once we reach that threshold, an electrical message is sent from our sensory neuron all the way to our brain through motor neurons. And our motor neurons then elicit physical responses to stimuli. When we're dealing with people who've experienced trauma, it's completely different. There are so many factors that go into what happens when there is a threat of harm or a dangerous situation. Their bodies at that time are releasing all kinds of stress hormones, sometimes adrenaline, and it's triggering what a normal process would be for your hippocampus in your brain to be able to work through all of that sensory information. What's happening is that's getting into overdrive and then overflowing into your amygdala. These are big neuroscience, words as part of your brain, but just a general understanding for practitioners to know that the parts of your brain are becoming completely overloaded upon trauma. What happens then is your brain says, this is important, I need to remember this forever, and it goes into a fight, flight, or freeze mode because there's this red alert happening inside of our brains. It's telling you you're in danger. And what you see is people either remember extreme amounts of information at the traumatic event, or they have amnesia and they can't remember anything, or they may have a fragmented understanding of what took place. There's a lot of biological things that are happening at that moment. If they are flooded with stress hormone and flooded with adrenaline, they may say, it's a blur. They may say, I've got this really big picture of what happened early on, and it's very clear to me the moment that the car came and hit, but then I don't remember anything after that.
But you know what, Allison, you know what this makes me think of? I may be an expert in family law, or I may be an expert in child welfare law. I may think I have a little experience from a long time ago being a prosecutor in Galveston County.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean I can call myself an expert in the area you're talking about.
Absolutely
So
not.
when these people, I tell people now in mediation, I've never walked in your shoes and you've never walked in mine.
Yeah.
And I need to remind myself about that throughout all this mediation. So help me understand some of what you're going through that's relevant to this mediation, right? And it makes me think of, man, just because I'm really good in area A doesn't mean I'm really good at intake with some people with a whole lot of stuff I'm not an expert in that I got to try to figure out how to help them.
Right. So I think it's just really important. And that's a great point, Tom, to be sensitive to who your client is and who, you're trying to derive truth. One of the most critical contributors to achieving a just outcome in assault cases, especially, is eliciting the most complete and accurate information from the primary source of evidence, which is the complainant. But if they are not able to recall information correctly, when these neural connections are broken down in our brains because of a traumatic event, their memory retrieval is affected. Even their memory recall altogether may be affected. So you might hear them say, I'll never forget. This is so burned into my memory, or it's a complete blur. When our bodies are put into a survival mechanism in a dangerous situation, your body doesn't take in sensory information about the periphery things around it. It's only locked into survival mode. So as you're interviewing a client, what you want to really keep in mind is, have compassion for them, number one. That's going to be the main rule. Have compassion for them. It can be really difficult for a victim to recall many details of an assault in a complete or linear way. Okay, especially if their mind has been fragmented or their mind is actually working well to try to protect them, but it's not working well for us to create the narrative and the story that we need to share, right? One important thing is, do not interrupt them while they are giving their narrative to you. When you interrupt them in their process of recall, that can actually do some damage to their ability to retrieve that information.
I'm sorry, Allison, would you repeat that again to all the lawyers who just glossed over that?
Yeah, absolutely. So
don't interrupt.
Have compassion for them, number one. Don't interrupt. Do not interrupt. Tom, don't interrupt. No.
I know.
But don't interrupt them, because it actually, the way that they are retrieving that information is very important to their memory retrieval. You also don't want to express any doubt. Lawyers kind of like to play the devil's advocate across the conference room and things like that. Hey, let me just throw this out here and try to show the weakness of what you're saying. Don't do that. Don't do that with trauma victims. It's very important. Do not express doubt. It could actually inhibit their ability to recall some potentially crucial information that's stored in their brain. Basically, what you do want to remember is that traumatic events are encoded and converted by the brain very differently from more routine memories and everyday experiences that we all, have. Know that memories can be fallible. They can have gaps. There can be inconsistencies that appear, but just stick with it. I would also encourage attorneys, you would tend to say, hey, why don't you write down your thoughts and give them to me? Make sure to preserve attorney-client privilege for your domestic clients' victims, that they're writing it in letter form to you. Dear Allison Spencer, here are my thoughts of what I've been able to recall, okay? Because you don't want a diary out there or something else that might be discoverable at some time in the future. So I would just caution you to make sure that you're telling them to deliver that information to you in attorney-client privilege form. The next thing is, dealing with coping strategies. How are you effectively able to help a domestic violence victim with coping strategies? They're going to have helpful choices, and they're going to have really maladaptive choices out there. And I think, some of the consideration is, we are attorneys and counselors at law. It's twofold. We're able to give them a paper that has your, suggestions, your resources, anything that stress management, coping strategies, things like that. It's very important to be able to communicate at that level with these domestic violence victims who are your clients. If you're going to fully advocate for them, you need to be able to share with them some self-help techniques, because you are one of their direct interveners in this process. You are one of the direct helplines in this process. They may not go to an appropriate counseling facility. So you are one of those first line of defense that can just make this suggestion to them. It will help them in the legal process as you move forward. So centered upon stress management, people like to self-soothe. And how do they self-soothe? It's with a coping strategy. It can be a really helpful choice. Those helpful choices we call, therapeutic lifestyle changes. That's going to include exercise. It's going to include nutrition, taking on new cognitive challenges, learning something new, or taking, a little class, or reading magazine articles about subjects that they're interested in. Basically, existing in the present and not existing in the moment of the domestic violence, okay? Because that's very heavy for them to deal with. They will need to deal with it, and they will need to deal with it with you as their advocate, but you also want to encourage them to engage in things like good nutrition, social relationships that are positive, and build resiliency. Full night's rest, very important. You know, you're sitting here getting ready to put someone who's experienced a traumatic event on the stand. That's a very stressful moment for these people. It's much more so than a regular witness who has not experienced some kind of trauma.
But you know what else? When they come to your law firm, the lawyer may be the fourth person they see.
Mhm.
They may see a receptionist. They may see a paralegal. You may have a junior attorney that you traditionally have them, go through the stuff. Do you bring everything? Did you bring your paperwork? Okay, you got your rape kit. Okay, all that, you got your tax, in taking a cavalier approach to just, and then they get to the attorney that they thought they hired. And by then, there may have been some really missed opportunities to handle them properly, Allison.
Yeah, I agree with that wholeheartedly. That's why I said at the beginning, hand them a resource, a piece of paper, a pamphlet of some kind that your law firm comes up with a lot of your general understanding about coping strategies, available resources, what happens from a domestic violence standpoint. It's not necessarily legal advice. It's just helpful advice that you can pass along to them, just as if we would hand them, a divorce care pamphlet or something like that, a parenting class pamphlet.
Speaking of passing along, you're past your time.
Oh, am I?
You are. Okay.
Excellent.
Now we have Barbara Grimer. Barbara, we are so excited to be partnering with the Texas Council on Family Violence. I believe in 2017 with the state legislature, you helped pass the requirement that custody mediators must take a 4-hour course. And that's why I came to you, because you also have your own program that's similar to what we're doing. And in fact, we're following your syllabus. But first, tell everybody about what is the course and the other resources you hold on your website.
Sure. Well, let me introduce myself. So my name is Barbara Grimmer, and I am the Child Welfare Policy Coordinator at the Texas Council on Family Violence. Prior to coming here in 2018, I spent about 10 years in Houston in the child welfare field, both as a conservatorship worker at DFPS and then as a staff and volunteer supervisor at CASA or child advocates there. So then when I came here, I started to work directly at that intersection of child abuse and domestic violence. So I do want to tell you a little bit about TCFV, if I can, Tom, before we get to the website. So we support survivors across the state as their lives intersect with the child welfare system or with the criminal and civil justice systems, with legislative policy, with the medical and mental health systems, with housing and homelessness, and so many other life situations. We are the only 501c3 nonprofit coalition in Texas dedicated solely to creating safer communities and freedom from family violence. We equip service providers with essential tools that they might need to support survivors. We initiate strategic prevention efforts, and we help to shape public policy that supports survivors. We've been around since 1978, and since then we've been nationally recognized as a leader to end family violence as we support over 89 domestic violence programs across the state. So I wanted to tell you, in all of these collaborations you can find on our website, but we do several large collaborations with other stakeholders at this intersection. So I wanted to tell you about some of those as well. I'll start with the Office of the Attorney General. Through them or with them, we have a Getting Child Support Safely website. And that helps to assist victims of family violence obtain child support services in the safest manner possible. It also helps victims determine whether or not even getting child support is going to be safe for them. For many victims of DV, as we've talked about here today, child support can help represent freedom from that financial abuse maybe, or financial control, and it can help them to establish and maintain their own economic independence from an abusive partner. But at the same time, the child support process can introduce even more safety concerns for some victims. Domestic violence can lead to violent altercations over child support and child custody that sometimes result in tragic outcomes for children and families. In fact, every year during October, which is this coming month, it's Domestic Violence Awareness Month, we release the Honoring Texas Victims Report, which, similar to what Anietta was talking about, identifies intimate partner homicides that occurred in Texas during the previous year. And every year, this report highlights the narratives of each homicide victim and the circumstances surrounding that homicide. And in so many of these cases, the violence escalated to homicide during these legal proceedings that are related to separation or child custody or child support. Through the Office of the Attorney General, we've also worked with several access and visitation programs across the state, helping them to develop their own domestic violence screening protocols and how to make their spaces safer for survivors. We also do a lot of work with DFPS. I know many of you intersect with clients who either have an active CPS case or have past CPS history related to domestic violence. So we all know that DFPS is a really important stakeholder in this world. Every region, all of the DFPS regions across the state, have a family violence liaison, and that representative serves as sort of the more DV informed representative in that DFPS region that can help staff DV cases with their colleagues and that can help form relationships with their local DV programs. And on the flip side, every domestic violence program across the state has a CPS liaison, and that role is most of the time assigned to an advocate that has several other roles as well. But in addition to that, they know a little bit more about the CPS process. They might know a little bit more about the court and legal process of CPS, and they too can help form relationships between the local family violence program and the local DFPS staff and caseworkers. One of the most important things that we do, or that I do in my role, is to help those relationships build locally. So that means even, with mediators, with attorneys, there's 89 programs across the state. So building a relationship with those programs can be a really helpful service to your clients, just making sure that that information is available to them and letting them know what sort of help they can expect to get. I also wanted to mention the BIP programs, Battering Intervention and Prevention programs. That's a court-approved educational program. It's designed to give someone using violence the tools they need to achieve healthy, intimate partner relationships. It teaches them to ideally identify the violence that they're using, the control that they're using, and it ideally will help them take accountability and change their behaviors. A good BIP program is also very survivor-centered and will seek feedback from the survivor to ensure that things really are getting safer. I did want to note that you can find a list of accredited BIP providers on the Texas Department of Criminal Justice website, which I'll link to, or you can contact the National Domestic Violence Hotline to find a list of programs, or the Texas Council on Family Violence. We're actually working to get DFPS to contract with more BIP providers so that those services can become even more available to families who need them. As Tom mentioned, yes, we recently in 2020 revamped our child custody mediator training, and now it's available all online in 3 different modules. And this does meet that requirement for the minimum of 4 hours of family violence dynamics training. We developed this right in line with the Texas Civil Practice and Remedies Code, Chapter 154.052. And these training hours can also go towards the 8 hours of family violence dynamics training required for other child custody professionals. That includes parenting coordinators, parenting facilitators, and child custody evaluators. Most importantly, I did want to note the resources we have available for survivors. So these are some of the things you can point your clients directly to on our website. We do have a technical assistance line that they can call at any time. We can connect them to local programs. We have a family violence program directory on our website as well. We can also, one of the most important pieces of information we have on there that Andy might have mentioned as well is the right to terminate a lease early if there's domestic violence. So we detail how they can do that and what documentation they might need to make that happen. And we also link to some information about the ability of domestic violence survivors to waive deposits as they try to get their new and independent home set up, whether that's your electrical bill, a telephone bill, gas service. And so we provide information about what they might need to do in order to get the proper documentation to waive that fee as well. We also link to a personalized safety plan, which could be a really good resource for y'all to keep on hand and direct survivors to. It helps walk them through some safety steps when they're still in the violent relationship, when they're thinking about leaving, and after they've left. We do know that after they leave is the most dangerous time, hands down, for a survivor. So if you're working with a client who's recently left her relationship, know that she is among the most dangerous situations she'll ever be in. So we do have some safety planning resources, and local programs will be able to help them walk through that process as well. We also have some information available.
Barbara, I would have never thought of that. I would have thought, oh, okay, you're no longer in danger. You're not around the guy.
It's
what an uninformed opinion for me to have if I'm doing intake of potential actual clients and I'm helping navigate the legal and the real life challenges they're going to have. I never even thought about that. That it's their most vulnerable, or you're saying in most danger after they leave.
Yeah, because as we've talked about through our other three speakers, it's about control. And when a survivor is able to leave, then that means the tactics he was using no longer work to control her. So he has to up the violence and escalate his controlling tactics. And that can often be homicide as the next step if nothing else has worked for him. And
Barbara, you've got about 4 minutes left.
Okay. I also think about my time in child welfare with so many domestic violence cases. We ask the mom to leave. Why doesn't she just leave? And I didn't realize at that time I was asking her to make the most dangerous choice she might ever make in her life. So it's really important to consider that. And I mentioned the Honoring Texas Victims report. As you read through the narratives in that report, you can see that the majority of them come after a separation, come after her mentioning she was going to leave, come after her making plans to leave, come after filing for divorce. Many of them are related to the act of separating.
Wow.
And so this is just about a broad overview of what we do at TCFV. I encourage you to go to the website, take a deeper look around. You can always call our information line or email our information web address, and we can get you more details about the services we offer. And we really appreciate the opportunity to be included here.
Yeah, I wanted to carve out a few extra minutes. I'm now sharing on the screen. Help us go around your website. You know, when I go to your website, I always go to the program resources, and it blows me away the work that y'all have done for executive leaders, for program administrators. There's BIPs, but I go down here as a mediator to the child custody mediators. Can you talk a little bit about this program and what it is? Because you were the ones who approached the legislature in 2017 to get them to change the law, correct?
Sure. Yep. And that was a little bit before my time. But following the 2017 session, we did draft the first iteration of that mediator training that met the 4-hour standard. And it was only in 2020, so last year, that we upgraded our virtual training. We brought in presenters from all over the country, experts on domestic violence, experts on mediation, experts on custody, and brought everyone's expertise together to really present a well-rounded, thoughtful training on how domestic violence intersects with child custody mediations.
What else would you like to show them on your website? We got about 2 minutes left.
If you want to click on the Find Help tab in the top right there, this is a great spot to send any clients that you know might be living with domestic violence. So if you scroll down top, yeah, survivors. And here is some of that prep that I was talking about with safety planning, thinking about the safety steps while you're in the relationship, while you're thinking about leaving and after you've left. It also gives survivors an idea of what to expect when they call a DB program. Because for many of them, they might have not known that shelters existed. They might have certain preconceptions about shelters. They might think they're more available or less available than they are. And this really gives some good background on what to expect. This is that personalized safety plan I was talking about that walks survivors through several.
I clicked here under personal. I don't know why it disappears when I mouse over it and tell you what people to fix that. But okay, here we go. Look at all this work.
That's really
Look,
good.
It's so detailed. Do y'all have a mobile app yet where this is all available?
I don't think that we have a mobile app, but this site, coincidentally enough, was just relaunched a few days ago. So I'm really glad that that happened before today. But I do think I think it's mobile friendly. I don't think we have an app yet.
Fair enough. Okay. The website is tcfv.org. For the Texas Modern CLE Victims webinar, this is the first presentation. The first 4 are modeled after your modules for the mediator compliance, as well as if you do court appointments as a family law ad litem attorney, amicus attorney, or if you do parent or child representation in a child welfare case, you're also required to do a family violence course. So that's why we built that in here, and that's why we followed your modules. But that being said, I really encourage people to go to the source, which is the Texas Council on Family Violence. They, to me, are the #1 source of information on this topic. We thank you for your syllabus that we're following. We also thank you for Krista Delgado, who will also be speaking, and I believe she's executive director, correct? Is that the right title?
Interim policy director.
Okay, policy director. And so thank you very much. I'd like to thank everybody. This concludes our presentation.
Thank you.